Welcome to the show. For anybody that isn't aware of you and the work that you do, could you tell us a bit about your background and how you initially got interested in evolution and clinical psychology?
Hi, Neil. Thanks for having me. It's always difficult to introduce yourself, especially when you start to get old. I'm 48 or something like that. I would say that I first graduated as a behavioral analyst, let's say that. And then I took interest in psychotherapy more deeply, and now I'm a professor of clinical psychology in France, in Grenoble Alpes University, for about 7 years now, only 7 years, because just before that I work as a psychologist in a psychiatric hospital. I used to work with people in psychiatric wards for about 15 years. So as you can guess, all this looks very far from evolution. Maybe in surface it looks very far from evolution, but the story of evolution started for me when I was an undergraduate. Actually, I was working on a very specific model, which is called ideal free distribution. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's a model that builds on the theory of game. You know the theory of game, John Nash's story. I know that there's been a movie on his story because he was suffering from schizophrenia. Theory of game, in a way.
The movie is A Beautiful Mind.
A Beautiful Mind, yes, exactly, A Beautiful Mind. Theory of mind. No, sorry. Theory of game. In a nutshell, it's a model that intends to predict huge groups of people behavior.
Yes.
And the ideal free distribution, the model on which I was working, was a model to predict the behavior of groups of animals, especially their choice of foraging species. And this was my first entry in evolution. And I was really fascinated by, especially by fashion. I mean, how a group of people could synchronize in their behavior. So I took an interest in an anthropologist which was called Marvin Harris. His model was cultural materialism, and I started to try to find a common place between behavioral analysis and cultural materialism, in order to understand at this moment what I wanted to understand was taboos in group of people, because taboos, do I pronounce it well? Taboos?
Yeah, like a taboo, yeah, something that's sort of frowned upon in society, and
exactly. Yeah. And taboo for me was the example of a group of people who were behaving in a way that wasn't optimal. And in evolution, there has always been a question about optimality. If you think too quickly about evolution, you think that it's a question of being optimal, because you think that selection is going to, in a way, how can I say that? Select organism. No, I'm sorry. If you think about adaptation too quickly, you're going to think that the game is to delete or suppress. I'm looking for a word, but I don't know what could be the right word. To kill, or I don't know, the individual or the species that are not adapted. But it's not that. Selection and adaptation is about selecting what works, not deleting what doesn't work. So in a way, I lost my my way in all that, but I was fascinated by the fact that we could use the very idea of natural selection for something else than species or genes. And so I jumped also in the in Dawkins' proposal about memes. Was very interesting for me. Now I know that we can criticize that, but the idea was, how could behaviors in a way spread in group of people? And then at the same time, I started to work as a clinical psychologist in hospital, but still I had that in mind. And the point is that when you are a behavior analyst, sooner or later you're going to find Skinner's writing about evolution, because Skinner proposed this very idea that selection by consequences at the scale of behavior is the same in a way, or resembles natural selection. So reading all that, it was something I would say obvious for me, that my job as a clinical psychologist was to select and to help clients select their own behaviors in a way, so that they could have a behavioral repertoire that match their context.
Very interesting. Now, you mentioned briefly there Skinner's idea of selection by consequences. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about this and why this is such an important idea for human behavior and changing human behavior?
Yeah, in fact, the question of evolution is also the question of what is selected. Okay. So we all have in mind, because the modern synthesis of evolution told us that what is selected is our genes. But you can also think that whatever varies, meaning whatever living system are or produce, will be the subject of selection and retention. And actually, this is the very idea that Skinner proposed. He said, just as species vary, behaviors also vary, just as individual from species would be adapted or not to the environment and then would be selected, some behaviors will be more adapted to their context, to their environment, then they will be reproduced. And he said, it looks like the process of natural selection. We can imagine that this resembles, really is the same. I think we need to come back to Skinner's writing to see if it was an analogy for him, or if selection of behaviors was evolution per se. It's not very clear. I think he thought about it as an analogy. Maybe what I bring on the table with my colleague Stephen Hayes is the fact that actually evolution doesn't care about phase or time scales or whatever. This is our invention, actually. I mean, for sure, Darwin showed us that it is important to think about change on very large time scales. But once again, what we would call evolution, of course, as you can guess, this is not a magic force somewhere or a spirit somewhere, but evolution actually doesn't care and doesn't know about time and time scale. We human, we slice the time in different parts, but if evolution is about retaining and selecting what works best in this very environment, it happens all the time. So it means that there is no scale in evolution. I mean, it happens in the long term. If the material that is selected is let's say a hard material, just like genetic, but it also happens right now at this very moment. I mean, or let's say it happens ontogenetically at the lifetime scale. My behaviors vary. They are selected depending on the consequences coming from the environment, and some of them will be reproduced. And this contributes to a larger picture of the evolution of my own species. So maybe the image will be a fractal. Do you know what a fractal is? Or is it the correct word in English? Fractal, do you know that word?
Is it sort of like a microcosm of a macrocosm? Like it's like a tiny slice of that represents the bigger kind of picture. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. The model of that, I think the word in English is a cauliflower. Do you know what a cauliflower is?
I'm not sure if it's the correct translation, but no worries. A cauliflower is like a vegetable, like a
Yep,
broccoli
exactly.
cauliflower. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So if you look at the cauliflower, you will see that the form of it, if you look at the large picture, is the same as if you look at a tiny part of it. This is a
Okay.
fractal, actually. A fractal is, let's say, a pattern that you can see from the larger picture, and also the same pattern from a more precise part of this larger picture. I think evolution is the same. I mean, there is evolution on a very large time scale, and for this kind of evolution, our material is selected, and also evolution on very short term. And then what is selected is, we could say, soft in a way. Or another way to say that is, if you are interacting with a part of the environment that stays the same for a very long time,
Yeah.
then what is selected is something about your structure. But if you are in interaction with part of the environment that changes on a very frequent pace, then what is selected is something that also can change very quickly.
Mm.
And here you find behavior. So my idea is that exactly as some of the material is selected on the long run, some of our behaviors are also selected. And the fact is that for about 10 or 15 years now, evolutionary sciences thinks the same. For a long time, for about, 50 years, evolution sciences were about genetics and genes.
Mm.
But since now 10 or 15 years, new data, and especially new data about the influence of behaviors, just brought the idea that our genes are highly sensitive to the context, to the environment. And it means that if our genes are sensitive to the context, to the environment, then the changes in the environment will feed back in a way on our genes. And then you can, you can see by yourself that our behaviors change the environment. And then if our genes are sensitive to the environment, it means that our behaviors change back our genes expression. Et voilà, as we say in French, means that for 15 years now, or 10 or 15 years, behavior has a place at the table of evolutionary sciences. And then it means a double movement, I would say, a bottom-up movement in which we as psychologists, we know a lot about behavior, we can inform evolutionary sciences.
Yes.
And so we do that job. Actually, we are trying to propose our ideas, especially our ideas about language, and our language could be understood and its place in evolution, in human evolution. So this is a bottom-up movement. And recently we also thought that we could have a top-down movement, meaning using the knowledge produced by evolutionary sciences and use it actually in psychotherapy.
Fantastic. Now, that's probably a good way to ask the next question. So, in your email signature and on your website, you have a quote: "Nothing in psychology makes sense except in light of evolution." And I can't pronounce the man's name that said it. I think he must have been Russian or something. But what I want to ask is, why is this so important to understand, especially for people working in clinical psychology and psychotherapy?
Yeah, the original quote is, I mean, in my email signature, there is the quote, and I wrote almost and the name of the guy, because it's not his quote. Actually, I transform it. The guy is very famous in evolutionary sciences. His name is Dobzhansky.
Okay.
Or something like that. And he's very famous because the title of one of his books was "Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution." As you can guess, meaning that evolution is recognized as I don't know how to qualify that, the pillar of any biological science. And after that, this quote has been proposed also in different fields. For example, you would find nothing in cancer makes sense except in the light of evolution, or nothing in ecology, or things like that. So I just transformed it to have nothing in psychology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So what does it mean for us? What was your question? What does it mean for us as psychologists or as psychotherapists?
Why is this such an important theory and model for people to understand if they're working in psychology and psychotherapy?
Okay, so I will give a very simple answer.
Okay.
Psychology is a life science. That will be my first answer about that. I mean, we can be conclusive on the fact that psychology studies living organisms, us. So it's a life science. We don't know any example of a life science that is not based on evolution. Why would psychology be out of evolution theory? It's a real question. I mean, if you think that human beings are not governed by the evolutionary principles, then you think that we are different in a way, that there is something more on our species. So I won't say that our species is not special. It is, for different reasons, especially because of language. But if you think that human beings are outside of evolution, that the very processes, the evolutionary processes, don't govern our behaviors, it means that you think, and you can think that. I mean, you're free to think whatever you want, but it means that you consider that human beings are so different comparing to the other animals that you need something more to understand them, or something different. I don't think that. I think that we are animals. Once again, very special animals. But still, the evolutionary processes govern our behavior. So now, if you try to understand part of what we do and part of what we feel of our emotions, and sometimes when it gets messy or difficult for us, why wouldn't you use evolutionary principle to understand that and maybe to change that? This is the simplest answer I can give.
That's really well put. Actually, you've said that really well, and I just wonder about what the origins of this sort of this worldview that sees human beings as separate from the rest of the natural world. I wonder, is this has its roots in religions or things like that? I don't know, but maybe this isn't the time to get into that. But what would you say are the benefits of having an evolutionary worldview in psychotherapy? Like, how is this, whenever you apply this in clinical work, what are the benefits to using it?
At first, I would say, because you just mentioned a question that you, you said it was a bit off topic, and you're right about it, but I can't resist to advise the reading of a paper from Stephen Hayes and collaborators. The title is Cooperation Came First. Maybe the difference for our species is about what we call sometimes theory of mind, or the way we can project ideas or thoughts to other people. And maybe that will be the difference about people think differently from us. I think all of this will explain in a way why we are so different, and at the same time we are responding to the same principles. And also, I'd like to mention a chapter that I wrote with Stephen Hayes as well, in which we proposed an hypothesis on the place, on the fact that evolution is responsible for the development of language, and language is a very special set of behaviors that, in a way, help us free ourselves from the, let's say, the natural course of evolution. So it's a bit tricky, but it's about the fact that determinism brought language to us, and then now we can have free choice. And in a way, we can choose our own evolution. But those stories are really, you're right on the fact that they are off the topic because they are highly speculative. We can't have data on that. So back to your question, what are the advantages of using the evolutionary processes in psychotherapy? I think this goes along the ideas about process-based psychotherapy. We are in a moment in which plenty of different models have been proposed, and especially during the last 15 or 20 years. I don't know if you followed that, but there are really a lot of proposal of new models. I think this is not surprising in a way. I mean, for example, consider the fact that I'm sorry, I don't have the right numbers in my head, but let's say 50 years ago, there were half of the humans that we have now on this planet. Maybe we were, I don't know if you can Google that, but I'm sure that 50 years ago, maybe there was 4 billion humans, or 3.5 or something like that. I mean, among that, the part of psychologists or academics searching all those ideas about how to help people who are suffering. That part was the same, but the amount of people was less important. So right now there are plenty of psychologists who are working on this. So I think it's not surprising that we have a lot of models that came out recently. But what I want to say is that in fact, it depends how you want to help people, and also how you consider psychological issues. In the behavioral wing, for a long time and still now, we are looking for what I would call universal processes. We want to discover processes that could be common to anyone. I mean, it's a strategy. You can choose to really select the part of people, the problem you want to solve, or you imagine that there are principles that explain the whole story about psychological issues. We are in the behavioral wing. We have this idea that the differences that we see among different psychological issues are not that important, and that we have to look for major movements that are responsible for psychological issues and psychological pain. But this doesn't contradict the fact that we can have different models. The question would be, what is common in these different models that would explain their effectiveness?
Yes.
So if you want to understand what is common, in a way, you go a step further. And if you do that a certain number of time, in the end, you will fall in a way on evolutionary processes, because it's an explanation or a proposition of explanation of living entities. And once again, we are living entities. So I think that would be the first advantage of this, the fact that it's a limited set of principles under which a lot of different models can, in a way, see or find why what they are doing can be effective. So maybe I can recall what are those movements, what are those principles in evolution. It's quite simple, actually. It's about variation, selection, and retention, meaning we need to have very different proposals of behaviors so that some of them will match the environment and will be reproduced. With these three principles in mind, I think you can take any model and see what it brings as novelty, as variation, or what it proposes to select certain behaviors, and how it helps reproducing certain behaviors. I think this will be the first major point. And I'm looking for the second one, but I forgot about it. Sorry about that.
It's okay. Well, I think this is a good, this is a good point to ask. The three big things in evolution are variation, selection, and retention. And also, I think Stephen Hayes builds on top of this. He says, within a certain context, at the right dimension, and at the right level as well. With the variation, how do you help clients? Like, how do you apply that particular principle with your clients in psychotherapy? Like, how do you help them vary their behaviors? Because this is the whole thing, if we keep doing the exact same things, we're going to keep getting the exact same results. So we have to have some kind of variation, so how do you do that in your work? Like, how do you apply this, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Maybe the first way to answer your question is at first to try to understand how their difficulties, how their problem appeared. I mean, if you want to propose something like a way to help people, at first you need to understand what are the processes that are responsible for their difficulties, right? So if you bring evolutionary principle in the game, you are supposed to explain or to propose how those processes are responsible for the suffering. And here, what we propose is the fact that evolution didn't get crazy for people who are suffering for psychological issues, but human beings have this particularity with language to focus in a way on a tiny part of the environment and to adapt to this restricted part of the environment. So our proposal is I mean, what we could call etiopathogenic proposal. So the way.
What does that mean? Sorry.
It means the way the psychological issues developed. What is the cause, in a way? What is the cause of those issues? And our proposal for that is the fact that we sometimes adapt to restricted part of the environment. For example, we adapt to our emotions here and now without seeing the larger picture. Or sometimes we adapt to the way we think about the environment, meaning we are adapting to what we say about the environment. And in the end, as you are, I would say, over-adapted to a restricted part of the environment,
okay, yeah.
Your behavioral repertoire is sooner or later is going to restrict, to be limited. And then you start to do the same every time. For example, you are always looking for a way for people to love you, or you are always thinking about the fact that your nose is too big, or things like that. As you can imagine, if you are over-adapted, I don't know if it's the correct word, but adapted to a tiny part of the environment, you start to be not adapted to the rest of the environment.
Yeah.
So what we do in psychotherapy is to first try to understand what is the restricted part of the environment that the client is over adapted. What does he repeat? What are the domains in which he is persisting, despite the fact that it is not successful for him or her? Okay, so this is functional analysis in a way. Functional analysis in which you are focusing on the repetitive behaviors, the forces that are selecting these behaviors, and how they are repeated. Okay, and then, as you can guess, I mean, we always did that in CBT. We try to change all that, so it means we are trying to bring variation in the repertoire, and I mean, in that direction, a lot of models in psychotherapy produce variation. I would say that even psychotherapy per se, written large, is a set of new behaviors for our client. Think about it. You don't have something or a place where you do the same as we do in psychotherapy. Where can you sit in front of someone else talking about your inner thoughts, your emotions, with someone that really listens to you without waiting for his turn or her turn to speak? Okay, I mean, when you're talking with a friend, that will be something different, because you are going to listen to your friend sooner or later. Here, the very framework of psychotherapy brings novelty and different behaviors. And we try to improve that, to increase that, meaning that we try to help people to gain back variation in their repertoire, so that some of this variation would be more adapted to their context. So this is the first thing that we can do. Variation is really, really important in psychotherapy. The second part is to help them changing their environment, so that they can change the selective force that are acting upon their behaviors. And as I told you previously, there is a way to change our behaviors by changing our environment, and this environment is going to change back our behaviors. So we help clients to organize new selective force in their life. And actually, we can consider ourselves, I mean, practitioners, as a new selective force. If you look at the process by itself, clients ask for our help, it means that they bring novelty, they bring variation in their repertoire. I mean, asking for someone help is different from trying to solve the problem by yourself. It's something new. And as soon as they ask for our help, we, in a way, are a new force of selection for their behaviors, because we are going to focus on certain behaviors and not others, or maybe reinforce certain behaviors or not. So we do that. And also, in the end, when some of those behaviors are appeared and are more adapted to their environment, then we could imagine that those behaviors are, let's say, naturally reinforced by the environment, the social environment, for example. But also we reinforce them so that the client retain and reproduce them more, and then they gain back their autonomy, and then bye-bye if everything went well. So you see the third time, the three times, sorry, the three movements here: variation, selection, retention, which are the same for any living entities around us.
That's fascinating. So in terms of selection, the second part, how how does a psychotherapist consciously help a client, find consequences and forces in their context that would help them to reinforce the behaviors that they want to change? Like, how do you practically do that? And maybe if we have an example of how that would happen in the real world, that would be really helpful for people.
Mm-hmm. As I told you before, our hypothesis is that, I mean, you become a client in a way. You need help as soon as you restricted your behavior to a tiny part of the environment. And this restricted part is about emotions that you are feeling here and now, or the fact that you are in another world, I would say, the world of language that brings stimuli that are not here and now. So this is the opposite picture. With that in mind, if you see that a client restricted his behavior or her behavior to here and now and to emotions, for example, what we have in phobias, your work will be to help him seeing the larger picture, meaning to take into consideration consequences of his behavior that are not here and now. So this is quite easy, actually, because a lot of clients even suffer from the fact that they see that they are losing opportunities. But it means also seeing what here and now represents, meaning to help them access the symbolism of what they are doing, to have more input from the environment, and actually the environment that is not here and now. So, for example, in acceptance and commitment therapy, what we would do in front of a client that is suffering from anxiety or phobia or things like that, and avoids a lot of situations or behaviors, is to help him taking into consideration what we call values. That is let's say, the reason why this suffering should be approached. And if you do that, it means that when the fear appears for that client, let's say the adapted behavior would be to escape or to avoid, but it's only adapted if you look at the fear that you are feeling here and now. It's not adapted to another part of the context. So at this very moment, with our work, meaning that we are going to help the client seeing what is important for them in this situation, the idea is to help them convoking, in a way, those stimuli that are not present here and now. But this could be an example.
I'm only starting to see just how compatible this all is with the psychological flexibility model, and even in terms of the variation. You were saying there that a big problem that people suffer with is they get over adapted to a particular thought or emotion or whatever. And it seems that a big part of psychological flexibility is widening the client's perspective and widening their view of the context, and involves a lot of those things. So maybe could you expand a bit on that there, if that's all right?
Yeah, it's I would say that I mean my short and first answer would be that's the same. Flexibility and psychological flexibility is about being sensitive to the context and to adapt our behaviors to the context. When we are talking about psychological flexibility, we are referring to the internal context. But it's, I mean, psychological flexibility is about selection of our behaviors so that they are the most adapted to the context. It's exactly the same, actually. If you look at the definition of psychological flexibility, it's about persisting or changing. You know about that, persisting or changing. We should be surprised with this definition, because actually it says two opposite directions: persist or change. What it means is being sensitive to the context, being able to persist or to change according to what comes from the context. I mean, persisting for someone who never persists, it's about change. Changing for someone who is not usually changing consists in persisting.
Okay.
And also, this is really tricky because we often think about the environment as something that is stable, something non-changing. The problem is that it is always changing. Consider that. If you consider situational environment, at first it is compounded from other people who are also living their own lives, right? So my external situational environment is going to change every time. My internal environment is also changing all the time, because each time you leave something is going to change your inner context. Everything changes all the time. If you don't change, sooner or later the train is going to pass and you are going to stay here. Psychological flexibility is only about producing variation, keeping variation, so that some of what you are able, some of the reaction you are able to produce to your emotions, thoughts, memory, and things like that would be more adapted than others.
Yeah,
You know, for
that's
example, it's exactly what when we say, for example, that avoidance is not a problem. Experiential avoidance is not a problem. It is always producing, in a way, or reacting in experiential avoidance, the problem. The problem is always doing always the same. If you are a species that never changes, you're going to die sooner or later.
100%. Well, Jean-Louis, that's pretty much all we've got time for today. It's been fascinating to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to share
You're
some of
welcome. My pleasure.
your knowledge with us. As a follow-on from this conversation, are there any resources that you would recommend people to check out? Now, I know you've written a chapter in a book called Evolution and Contextual Behavioral Science. Is that something that people should look into? And anything else?
I was about to advise this book. I think it could be a first good place, a good place to start. So because it's an edited book, so there are plenty of different voices in that. So I think it could be interesting to jump into that. And also, I would advise to go in the direction of process-based CBT. And Stephen Hayes wrote a book about that with Stefan Hoffman. I think the very spirit of that is that we want to work because we didn't talk about the difference between the process-based approach and categorical approach, but I think we are talking about that. Evolution is about processes, not about something that is strictly and definitely described. I mean, if you are in the how can I say that? Um, Dividing the world in different parts and think that the world doesn't change is a direction that revealed not very effective in psychotherapy. We need to think complexity. This is actually what contextual behavioral science is about. When you think contextually, it means that everything is going to change every time. And I think we need to focus on processes in psychotherapy. And this book about process-based CBT is also something that you could read with the lens or the glasses of evolutionary processes in mind. You will see there that the processes on which we are focusing are about variation, selection, and retention.
Brilliant, brilliant. We'll link to those in the show notes for this episode. But Jean-Louis, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much. And also, everyone, Jean-Louis has got a workshop. I'm not sure when the next one is, but it's called Darwin as Your Clinical Supervisor. And this is basically some of the stuff we've covered today. Jean-Louis goes into it in more depth. And maybe you could tell us a bit more about this workshop. And is there another one coming up soon, or what's the latest on that?
Yeah, I didn't schedule it for the moment, but it will be on my website in a couple of days or something like that. In a nutshell, the workshop is about everything we covered here, but in a practical way. I mean, there are a lot of role plays and exercises in which I give plenty of advices to the practitioners on how they can bring variation in their client. For example, how to use extension to have variation, how to reinforce variation, how to use our own behaviors as a selective tool, and things like that. So sometimes we think about different clinical moves, even coming from other traditions, and we try to understand how this could be something in direction of the evolutionary processes that we just talked about.
Fantastic. Well, we'll link to the website as well, so people can check that out after listening to this. So, Jean-Louis, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and best
My
of luck to you.
pleasure. Thank you, Naim.